This new router is where I've tried to rewrite the routing experience from the ground up with types involved. And so that means that everything from route definitions, even the nested definition stuff, is all type safe. And the resulting types, or the resulting routing structure that you get, it's fully typed. And then all of the APIs for consuming that routing structure need to be fully typed as well. Lots of different challenges in each of those different layers.
Hey, before we get started, we'd like to announce we have a few new ways that you can subscribe to the podcast. With your subscription, you'll have access to all the full-length versions of our interviews. You can now subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. With that, let's get on to the episode. Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited today to have Tanner Linsley joining us. If you have heard of TanStack, React Query, many other things that Tanner's been working on. Tanner, such a pleasure. Really excited to talk to you. I use your software every day, so it's great to have you. But before we dive into the topics, would you like to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure thing. Let's see, I've been doing front-end development exclusively for about 10 years now. Programming for about 15. Got my start in WordPress and PHP. And then eventually got roped into open source big time. So over the years, really been pouring more and more time into open source, trying to open source as much as I can, and tackling the more difficult problems as time goes on. About 8-9 years ago, I started a company with some friends called Nozzle that is, it's search analytics for like marketers and SEO people. But in a nutshell, we basically reverse engineer Google's search rankings. Like everything that comes up on that search page, we just like pull it out, stick it into a database. So we're just creating tons of data every day. And then trying to visualize it. So building a SaaS product around that, you can kind of start to see why some of my open source libraries kind of popped into existence. Tables, charts, querying, and now a router. So yeah, there's lots of fun challenges that came up from that. And it just keeps sucking me in further. So got a healthy startup and a lot of healthy open source tools, and things are going great.
Yeah, it's really cool how, like, as you built out Nozzle, you open source like seemingly every single part of the front end build pipeline and libraries. So typically that's a lot more work than not doing that. So why did you approach it in that way instead of just building out Nozzle with only internal stuff?
So we've been really lean from the beginning. In fact, the most employees we've ever had on the front end team, including myself, is 2. So
Wow.
For better or worse, I've taken on a lot of responsibility and worn a lot of hats. And I have found that one of the only reasons I've been able to keep up with the demand on the product is because I've taken the most crucial, performance-driven parts of our application, the critical pieces, and pushed them out to the edge of the community. So all of our querying, all of our tables, as much as I can, I push out into this open source layer. And in a way, I kind of have a bunch of people working for Nozzle, finding the bugs, making it better, and just overall helping me have really stable tools at the core of our product. So that's part of the reasons why I do like to open source it. Second of all, I think that just kind of the nature of a lot of front-end technology is just kind of open in general. It's really difficult to hide front-end code behind intellectual property. And also there's not a super good alignment of incentives there anyway. So if you can open source it, I think it's a good choice. And probably the third reason is that I found that when I started designing and developing APIs for open source consumption, it improved the overall quality of my code. So honestly, even when I'm developing something new inside of Nozzle that's kind of a fairly large piece, I will approach it as if it could someday be open sourced. And that just helps with a lot of things. API design and documentation, making sure it has great TypeScript support. If you approach problems with that mindset, it definitely changes the way that you structure even things that are internal or private.
That's really fascinating. It seems like there would be a few things that fall out of that. I mean, the very clear benefits, as you said, is like better documentation, and you get like all these extra eyes on the code base. But you also have people who want functionality and features that your product doesn't necessarily have a need for. So how do you sort of balance like what are the internal needs for Nozzle versus like what the community wants out of a particular solution?
I think the best answer I have to that is just inversion of control. If somebody is asking me for a feature that they can't implement themselves or wrap up into, some abstraction or a plugin or whatever they want, I think that's a clear sign that the API needs some better points of inversion. So, just maybe a couple of years ago, I had my React table library, but it was a really coupled to the DOM, coupled to the markup. And I saw that people were requesting a lot of features around markup and can we move things where we want and can we rip this out and put our own component in, and it was going to take a lot of time for me to add those features. And yes, I didn't need a lot of those things, but I think that was an indicator that we just had some bad abstractions. And once we took the table library, React table, and made it a headless library, where we're just going to supply the logic and the state management and the non-opinionated markup things about it. All of those issues and all of those requests kind of melted away, and we structured it so that it had a lot of inversion of control around the core features. So now you have people like Kevin Vandy who have built entire table components and table libraries around the core use table hooks. And that's the power of like the right, points of abstraction. So I don't have to worry about any of that stuff now. If somebody wants a feature, they can build it themselves. And if they suggest, and I'm like, oh, that'd be good for Nozzle too. We'll work on it together, So I think it's just, part of it is API design and part of it is just saying no. Like, hey, that's a great idea. And I will support you as much as I can by providing the right API options and abstractions and points where you can kind of hook into the library. But beyond that, if it doesn't align with Nozzle, I don't want to have to just say, no, it's impossible. Mostly it's like, hey, no, I can't do that, but it's possible if you want to put in the work. So that is the balance. And at least it has been for me. And it's working out great so far.
Awesome.
You mentioned TypeScript a little bit in there, but if I remember correctly, when you started on your TypeScript journey, you weren't fully on board. I remember you having a lot of struggles at the beginning with trying to type your very dynamic, large JavaScript libraries. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey there? Because I think now you're fully on the TypeScript bandwagon and understand the benefits.
Absolutely. So early on, the notion of types was a little jarring at first because I didn't come from a typed world. But I did become very familiar with Golang. A lot of our backend is written in Golang, and all of our backend devs are Go guys, and it became immediately apparent to me that types were extremely critical and crucial for scaling a business and scaling teams and processes and just having more confidence in your code. So I wasn't necessarily against the idea of types from the beginning, but I was just very scared to learn it because I knew that it was going to detach me from my momentum for a little while. So timing was a critical piece for me. And when you have libraries that are moving quickly and you're one of two people on a front-end team and you're just kind of moving very quickly there, it's difficult to sell yourself on, okay, I'm going to just kind of halt everything I'm doing and start learning TypeScript. To make matters even more complicated, it wasn't that I was just halting work on like our application, like our SaaS product, because application on the spectrum of consuming application TypeScript and providing library level TypeScript. Those are very different things. I was going to have to do both, and I didn't necessarily want to do them separate. So when I learned TypeScript, I wasn't just consuming it in my SaaS product and using it kind of in a very I guess end user developer way. But I had to learn it from a very complex context as well, in being able to write really great generics. I had to learn all about generics, and I had to learn about architecture, how to build libraries with TypeScript in mind, and I had to learn about how the compiler worked and how types flowed through a system. I had to learn the do's and don'ts of plugin development and extending TypeScript types and extend like system extension in TypeScript. And some of it was just over my head because I just had no idea what was going on. So it took a little bit longer for me to kind of ramp up because I jumped into the deep end on purpose.
Yeah.
But it was extremely helpful because now I feel like, I'm not scared of generics at all. I'm not scared of building library code or writing generics. And it doesn't mean I know everything. I actually, there's so many people out there that know so much more about like complex TypeScript. And now I know who those people are, and I can just say, hey, help me write this. I can understand it and wrap my head around it eventually. But that's kind of where I ended up. And it was harder at first. So it literally took me probably 6 months to get anywhere even remotely useful with my libraries, especially React Table was the library that I started with. It's a very complex library. It had lots of plugins and options and lots of types that permeated the entire system. So it was difficult. But once I got it down, it only took me about another 6 months to be like, okay, I think I have a handle on this. Moving to other libraries, and React Query was actually the first one to get fully moved over with some help from the community. And to be honest, React Query is not too complex of a TypeScript project. There's not a whole lot of types there. In fact, we mostly just manage about 3 to 4, maybe 5 in some places, generics that kind of flow through the entire system. As opposed to something like Table and Router that, are anywhere between like 9 to 15, depending on where you are. So, yeah, it's been rewarding. And I knew from day one that it was going to change the way that I thought about programming. It's going to change the kind of developer that I was. So it was mostly just finding the right time. And yes, I complained, and I was like, oh my gosh, everyone's asking about TypeScript, and I don't want to build TypeScript right now for my library. Just leave me alone. So I think everybody kind of does that to some point when you're seasoned in the ecosystem and you need to learn something new and you've got a lot of baggage, it can be hard to jump in. So my invitation to anybody listening is that the time to jump in has passed. You need to get on board. I still have friends who are swimming against the current, and I just don't understand why, because the water is warm.
Yeah. I think where you approach it matters a lot. Like, if you approach it as an app developer, like TypeScript seems like just trivial. Like, it's like, oh yeah, I'll add that to my project. But at the library level, it's a totally different game. And from what it sounds like, you didn't just jump into the deep end, you jumped into the very deep end because you weren't writing the libraries in TypeScript. You were trying to define DTS files for your library, which in my mind is like an order of magnitude harder.
Yeah, I decided that early on that like adding types to the library was not really helping me. It was very quickly that I just decided it's going to be a rewrite, and I just basically nuked all the code. I kept the implementation code for a lot of it, but basically just had to nuke everything and start from scratch. It was difficult because, like you said, some of the dynamic parts of JavaScript are just untyped. The way that we design APIs in old school JavaScript, it's just there's no meaningful way to keep and retain and convey that type information. So it requires you to rethink the way that you structure. And I think some people see that as a downside. They're like, oh, it's changing the flexibility and the power that I have. When in reality, it's just making you think in a safer way. And it's making you structure your code a little bit better. Like, in no way do I think it degrades any of the final output. If anything, it's 10 times better, right? It's just different.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting. Well, first off, it's really fascinating to hear about your sort of compressed journey with this, because from going to little experience with types to like having this like, these pretty robust libraries being fully typed or whatever is this whole massive effort, and you went through that really, really quickly. Even the sort of like cognitive shift from like, oh, I don't really want to do this, to like, okay, yeah, this is the way, is sort of an interesting thing to hear about, in sort of what I still consider a compressed timeline, because I've heard stories that are like many years in transition of like really trying to come to acceptance with it. But it's, I think it's so true that there are things that you pick up on when you adopt TypeScript or like any type language. But one of the things is, I think, about being more explicit with your intent, just like using it as a tool for communication, because, code is written for people as much as it is for computers. I think that's something that we don't value enough. And then just going back to an earlier point too, I had also, when I started trying to do TypeScript stuff, I'd started trying to just like add like DTS files, definition files to JavaScript projects. And it was so hard. One of the things is I found that was not the best documented workflow. TypeScript is generally, they have good documentation, but like that, the outer edges of type definition can be a lot more complex. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Interesting. But that
Totally
definitely reflects my experience.
I remember you triggered a memory going back. One of the very first individuals to help me out with TypeScript was Brandon Beyer, creator of Blitz, Flight Control. And, I remember being on a call with him, and he's just kind of showing me the ropes, and he was like, yeah, let's design this API that you have in your mind for this table library that you have. And we started talking, and he was just writing types and declaring functions. He didn't write any JavaScript at any point in time. And I was like, how are you doing this? This is so strange, and then, he'd go to like call the function, and it was all just auto-completed and type saved. And I'm like, but there's no implementation there. And he was kind of the very first person to help me really understand that TypeScript meta typing is its own language. And really, if you want to be productive and you want to feel powerful with TypeScript, because it's really, try writing a program without doing any implementation code. Just declare types and functions and just see how far you can get. And I think that's really when you start to dive into what TypeScript really is, right? In fact, I need to pull up my Twitter, because there's a project that I've been seeing lately that got me really excited. And let me just scroll through my timeline here for a second and see if I can find it. But let's see. It's a meta TypeScript library that is being developed. Somebody that I know on Twitter. I can find it. Just give me a second. Yes. So, his handle is Eckerby. I'm not sure. It's ECYRBEDEV is his handle. He's tech lead and creator of Zodios.org. But he has been working on this new library called, basically he's created like a programming, like it's almost like Lodash. It's very much like TS Toolbelt, but for types. And you can pipe types through transformers and map things. My goodness. If we have to, I will find it and put it in the show notes after. Because, hot script. There we go. So, it's a library of composable functions for the type level transform your TypeScript types in any way you want using functions you already know. So like the first example here is where he's piping the integer 7 through a bunch of like type transformers. He's got tuples range, tuple take, tuple map, match, tuples join, and you can just see if you go down to all of the different methods that they have implemented. We're talking things like we've got tuple manipulation, which is basically arrays, object manipulation. There's unions and strings and numbers and booleans. So he created a JSON parser in TypeScript, like that parses JSON in the type level TypeScript language. And he created it in just a few lines of code. It was really crazy.
I think that's something that people may not appreciate with TypeScript, especially if you're coming from a JavaScript world and TypeScript's your first type language. TypeScript actually has an incredibly powerful type system. And it really goes to show that like Anders knows his business. Like,
yep.
It's incredibly impressive.
Oh, here's the link to that tweet where he shows a JSON parsing in TypeScript type system in just 50 lines. So using HotScript, he creates a JSON parser that will parse a string of whatever into like JSON type. It's
Wow.
incredible. Anyways,
Yeah.
we don't need to go down that tangent any further, but that can be like the capstone of the TypeScript conversation. But it really is incredible what you can do with it.
Yeah, it is crazy what you can do in the type system. The craziest thing I've done is I created a grid component for our design system that takes a grid template as a string and then breaks the template up into types and returns grid cells that can only use those as the area for their types. So it
So cool.
uses like joins and trims, and like it's very hard to understand code while you're looking at it, but like the types are like, oh, it's just doing kind of like JavaScripty things.
That's awesome.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
There's another thing that I wanted to talk about before we move on and start talking about particular libraries. So one of the things that you've done recently is you've started making your libraries not React specific. So making them where they're shareable across different front-end frameworks. I thought that was a really interesting choice as well because, like the migration, the learning path from like, untyped to typed libraries, going from like a targeting at a single framework to targeting at like, generic usage is a really, really challenging thing to do well. So could you talk a little bit about like what motivated that and maybe even, share some of your experience about like what you've learned from that process?
Yeah. That transition that's still happening felt really natural because of underlying technology innovations that were kind of happening. So I think the first one for me was hooks. When hooks came out, it kind of kicked my mind into reusable logic mode, right? And no longer was I thinking like, oh, everything needs to be a component, we can just have hooks. And that kind of started detaching my brain from the two and decoupling. And I'm like, oh, you know what? Headless UI is where it's at. And the first library I used was Downshift from Kent C. Dodds. I was like, oh yeah, headless is super cool. So I was like, let's headless at everything. Let's go all headless for everything, right? But still React. And then at that point, I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's reusable logic, like how much would it take to then decouple that logic from React utilities that I was using? Like React Table, even when it was just a hook, used to be implemented with a bunch of React hooks under the hood. It's like use state, use memo, everything's use memoed and use callback everywhere. And I was just like, this is, but I wonder what it would take to move all that logic into an agnostic layer. Still hook it up the same way in like a React adapter. So that's kind of what I did. And I think it was just kind of this move to headless that it was like, oh, how headless can we go? I'll be honest, I don't have any applications. Maybe. No, I don't anymore. I don't have any applications right now that aren't React, like that I have like in production. So I don't necessarily have an immediate use case to be like, oh, let's go framework agnostic and let's I need that. But it was easy enough after I went headless, it was kind of just a skip and a hop to rip out all the React stuff and replace it with just kind of an adapter. And that exposed some interesting patterns along the way. It reveals to me more clarity the pros and cons of React, the great things about it and the things that I'm like, I don't really like that so much. And then it started getting me thinking about other libraries and frameworks, and a lot of the challenges that came up that are still coming up in trying to make agnostic tools and the different ways that every single framework thinks about reactivity. And I know that signals are a really hot topic right now, but I think they're very important to talk about, because most of the entire ecosystem outside of React thinks in terms of signals or observables. And they have for a while. If you go back before React, it was kind of all about signals and observability and kind of this mutative API for a reactive system. And React was kind of one of the first ones that was like, you know what, we're going to throw reactivity out the window and basically just going to create this massive immutable system. And immutability honestly wasn't all that popular, even in data, like even in front end, in data, like data flow. Immutability wasn't super popular until the React ecosystem really pushed it into overdrive, including me. Like I grew up, on React with this immutable paradigm, and so it was really interesting talking in the early days with Ryan Carniata. He's showing me solid and he's showing me signals and all these different ways to approach reactivity, and because I wanted to build solid adapters for all my libraries, and it really showed me that React is honestly kind of weird in a great way. Like it's really easy to reason about data and immutability when you're in that mode, but it comes with a lot of weird immutable overhead, like use memo and use callback. We're talking about compilers now. So most of my learnings through going agnostic have been shedding more and more light on just kind of these weird differences between these libraries. And I think at the surface level, everybody looks at Vue and React and Svelte, and they used to see maybe differences, and it was like template versus JSX, how do we do our markup and single file components? And a lot of that is becoming, it doesn't matter anymore. Like JSX is clearly superior, let's be honest. But what really is coming down to matter for me is just like the data flow and the data model. And kind of the last big like aha moment I've had with a lot of this is, I was looking at my spreadsheets for like my budget and spreadsheets for things at work, and I'm looking at Excel and I'm just like, what a fantastic performant system. Excel's amazing. Basically built on signals, observability, right? And you can create crazy UIs in Excel. And it just got me thinking, maybe it's time to go back to signals. And now all the talk about signals and everything. So that's kind of been where my head had been with moving agnostic with all this stuff. It was very natural to push the boundaries. And I've gotten to the point now where I'm pushing maybe a little too hard on some of the agnostic stuff. And I've actually had to rebound a little bit. And that's mostly in the router that I'm building, if we want to talk about specific use cases. All of the other tools I have, Query, Table, the virtualizer, a lot of these tools, they fit really well into the agnostic, ecosystem. But the router is not one of those things. Like early on, I was like, even in my hype video that's on my Twitter right now that I showed at JamstackConf, it was like agnostic router. And it's like, could we build the agnostic router? It's like, yes, I did it. And you can build adapters for it. But you wouldn't leave the hoops that we were jumping through to get a core router state management system to work with both React and Solid. It was working with Ryan Carniato on this. It was like either way you're going to pay. If you build your core state management in an immutable fashion, you have to pay in performance to get it to work in an immutable system like Solid. And then I was like, what if we just wrote the state management for all of our libraries in Signals and Solid and stuff like that, like just Signals. And then we downsampled it to immutability for React. And you pay big time going that direction too. They're just so much at odds with each other. And then, over the last few weeks, I've been on vacation for 2 weeks, to be honest. And I got back, and one of the big realizations I had is that every single framework has its own router that's relatively first class for that framework, except for React. For whatever reason, I mean, we know the reasons. React was like, we're just a UI library. We're very unopinionated,
Yeah.
At least that's how it was.
Yeah.
We could talk about the differences today, but React was one of the first ecosystems where it's like, there's that it's even really possible to build a bunch of different great routers. And there are so many of them out there. Obviously React Router is the most popular, but there's like Wouter, and Next.js has their own weird router now. So thinking about it from that perspective, Router is the only library where I've kind of like dialed it back, and I'm like, okay, not everything needs to be agnostic. Router is framework, kind of. So I've dialed it back to make TanStack Router React only. And honestly, the hope is that I can take the ideas and the core out of that and transport that to other core routers like the Solid router. Like, I'd love to help Ryan, rewrite the Solid router to be completely type safe and have all this great stuff. So sorry, that was really long-winded, but
So moving on to like what you're currently working on, you mentioned earlier that you're working on a new router for React. So why another router? How is it different, and what is it doing differently?
great question. So yes, it's a new router. I honestly didn't want to have to build it in the beginning. At Nozzle, we have a lot of dashboards, and these dashboards are showing a lot of data, a lot of widgets. They're data exploration dashboards, and essentially every dashboard is like a function that just has a lot of widgets on the screen, and each one of those widgets has its own parameters and its own state. All of that needed to be stored in the URL, like every bit of it. And we looked into ways of taking the state and hashing it and putting it on the server and sharing links with IDs. And it's just a terrible experience to do it that way. It's so much better to leverage what's already there in the URL. So in the beginning, I just wanted to design this entire dashboarding experience so that all of the widget state and everything lived in the URL itself. And essentially, that meant taking this big JSON structure that represented the state of each dashboard and finding ways to reliably serialize it into the URL and bring it back out. And it wasn't that difficult to get my hands dirty in the beginning. I was using React Router v5, search params, and just kind of doing it in a really hacky way, right? And then I was like, might as well try React Router v6 beta. So I was actually using the beta in Nozzle for a while. It was in beta for a long time. But then some problems quickly arose with that. The first one that was very apparent, even from v5, was that when I started moving everything over the TypeScript, a lot of my libraries were moving over. Things were getting better, but one thing that was kind of like lagging behind and stuck in the Stone Ages was the routing logic. And at first I was like, routing, like it's not that bad. You don't need to be super type safe. Then I was like, oh crap, all of my search parameters are coming out of the router. And that's driving a majority of my state now. And in fact, the more and more that I got into using the URL for state, which I think is a really great pattern, and we should be doing it more. So much of my state was moving from use state into the URL. And honestly, if you think about TypeScript and types and state, like that's where all of your state comes out of usually. It's just like use state. Moving it into the URL is basically moving it into this new black box that I lost all my types and essentially had to start like typecasting everything. And that just, it's terrible because it doesn't track through the entire system. And it's just hacky. And it kind of I started opening up this black box of like type safe URLs and type safe routing. And I started learning a lot. I started learning that the URL as a serialization destination acts a lot like an external asynchronous resource, as you would with any other external state. When you fetch it and you get it back, you kind of have to validate it because it's just coming from a JSON string. So similar to how people are like writing Zod schemas for, their CRUD, their CRUD fetches and fetch and GraphQL schemas and whatnot. The URL exhibits those same features where you're essentially allowing users to input whatever the heck they want into this box on the screen. And you need to reliably parse it, validate it, set defaults, and at the same time type it so that you have a consistent and reliable interface coming out of it. That entire pipeline was just, it's not that it wasn't built in, but it was even difficult to do in userland with React Router v6. I basically had wrapped every function, every export, everything that I could get out of React Router v6, I had wrapped and proxied until the point where I was just like, I've basically rewritten my own router just through this proxy layer. That's how React Location was born, which was my toy router. It wasn't type safe, but it was me kind of just getting a grasp on how to build a router. And finally, this new router is where I've tried to rewrite the routing experience from the ground up with types involved. And so that means that everything from route definitions, even the nested definition stuff, is all type safe. And the resulting routing structure that you get, it's fully typed. And then all of the APIs for consuming that routing structure need to be fully typed as well. Lots of different challenges in each of those different layers. And we can talk about those if you want. I think they're all interesting. But yeah, types were the biggest driver for this. Obviously, it wasn't too difficult and very obvious for me to layer in things like data loaders and actions and layer in, nested routing is kind of just the new standard. So it was easy for me to take some of the best parts of React Router and Next and Wouter and just kind of put it all together and build the system that I wanted. And it's got support for Zod schemas, and it's a lot of fun and it's a joy to use. So some of the features right out of the gate that I can tell you, like all of the paths are type safe. So it's basically impossible to write a link that isn't type safe. So if a page doesn't exist or a route doesn't exist, you'll get red squiggles for it. If it requires search params, you have to supply them. They have to be the right type. If you're writing links that are relative, like it knows about relative link navigation and where you are. It knows all the types know about your nested nature of your routes. So if you're in a deep component, you're not just getting routes or type information for the route you're in, but the parent, the entire routing structure is actually reduced as you go down the usage APIs. So you're, down here at the, level C, you've got type information for A going into B and going into C and kind of getting intelligently merged together so that you know of all of the search params and all of the loaders and all of the things that you have in that. And even in the definition files or the definitions themselves, you can define search parameters in a top level route and then have nested routes. And in the definition itself, it will know about the types that you have created in parent routes while you're in your definition, which is easier said than done. Yeah. It's required some interesting API design and to get around this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's what I needed. And so I'm actually still hooking it up into Nozzle. But what it means is that all these widgets and all these crazy things that I have on all these different dashboards, when you hover over a link, I know of a surety that it's going to a place that exists with search parameters that are exactly what they need to be, and that the URL that's produced is going to be exactly what the user wants to see, and they can share it, and collaborate with it, with teammates, and I mean, just day one of popping in a Nozzle, I found like just tons of bugs, just trying to pass search params that don't exist and passing numbers where they should be strings. So, yeah.
Must be a good feeling finding those bugs.
Good and sad. Oh man, Tanner, you were an idiot. Why did you do that? But I mean, I don't blame myself too much. I didn't have TypeScript, so it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's fun.
So all of that type safety comes pretty easily from like the user standpoint. I saw in the docs you kind of do this like one cool trick to make the types available. I think what you do is like you declare your router, and then right below it you do like a TypeScript declare, and then declare an import, and that like kind of just makes everything work, right?
Yeah, because without that, you would have to provide an API layer that consumes the router everywhere that you use it, which is still possible if you, for some reason, can't do it the way that we want. So instead of doing that, you're right. So we use something that's kind of an interesting hack in TypeScript. Not really a hack, but it's just an interesting pattern. It uses declaration merging, but what we do is we export an empty interface called a register. And we export that interface. Actually, we're doing it across almost all of the libraries now. There's just a register interface. And what you can do is you can declare that interface, and then under specific keys for different libraries, like so in router, it's the router key. So you declare the router key, and then you pass type of your router. And what that does is it registers, because interfaces are mutable, it registers the type of your router into the inner type space of like the entire module. And what that means is that now when you go to consume exports right out of the library, like use route or link or something like that, we can actually just reference a special type inside of the library called registered router. And registered router is it's a conditional type that says, hey, if registered dot router extends a router, use that. And if it doesn't, then just use kind of the default router type. And that way you can provide type safety to the rest, like to all of your top level exports, without ever having to necessarily import your router everywhere you go. It's pretty great.
Yeah, super cool pattern.
We're actually using it in React Query now in the next version. So you're going to be able to, you can actually set the default error type so that if across your entire system, you know that you're only, you want Axios errors or something, you can actually register the error type and pass Axios error. And that will set the default generic across the entire library to be that. So there's a lot of cool use cases for it, for setting type defaults without being forced to use APIs that rely on scripted composition, to get that kind of default.
That's awesome. You got some stuff that you're working on in the future. You've had this TanStack brewing, and it's brought together all these like disparate technologies, and we've heard chat about some other future projects that you have. So there's this thing called Bling, and some sort of other stuff in this space. Could you sort of talk about what some of your future plans are here and what you're currently working on?
Absolutely. So my future plans can be summed up by collaboration. So essentially, I'm always just kind of looking for just the fastest way to get something done, and moving up into the upper spaces of tooling. Getting into routing. Routing is a significant portion of what we would consider frameworks, and after that, a lot of what it constitutes a framework really comes down to, usually there's some level of like opinionated routing structure for file systems, and then there's opinions around deployment, And then there's also opinions around kind of like co-location of code and server code and full stack kind of things, right? And so after exploring what that would look like for something like TanStack Router, I came to the conclusion that a lot of these concepts about frameworks are not really that unique. The routing experience and the framework that it's built on are super unique, but meta frameworks overall, they share a lot of the same tools, a lot of the same goals, and naturally, uh, you know, there's a lot of prior art in React. You've got Next, you've got Remix, you've got Gatsby. A long time ago, I even built React Static, which was a static site generator framework that I had to let go back in the day. But I didn't necessarily want to recreate anything here in this space, but I wanted the ability to have a full stack framework that I would also be able to use my router in. Because if I move to Next, I lose my router. And I know they're working on type safe routes. Good for them. It's still, not exactly where I'd like it to be. Maybe they'll get there eventually. But then I also didn't want to have to be forced into most of the Next ecosystem as well. If I move over to Remix, it's the same story. I have to drop my router. Everything seems to be based around the router, right? And I have strict ties to my router now. I demand the type safety I want out of my router. And I demand the APIs that I have to build these scalable solutions that are really search param heavy. And nobody else really seems to be taking that seriously. And that's fine. It's mostly it's not a massive use case for a lot of other people. But like if you were to go to AWS or Google Cloud Console, look at that URL. Clearly they have built their own URL because of how much state they're storing in the URL. All right, they've built their own router. So I wanted to get into this space, but I wanted to be able to use my own router, but I didn't want to build the rest of anything else. So I talked about this to Ryan Carniato. We talk a lot, if you didn't gather that. And he was like, "Oh, that's really interesting. In Solid, we just kind of have our router, but then we have we have these transforms that happen at bundle time." And so he started showing me, the server $sign approach they have for a lot of stuff. And he's like, it's kind of like Quick, but it's not exactly like Quick is very proprietary and they're based on resumability. He's like, this is mostly just about code extraction. And I was like, this is really interesting. How could I use this for my framework? And he's like, oh, I don't know. And that kind of started the conversation between me and him and Nikhil Saraf, who is heading up a lot of like the work under Bling. Like he's a lot of the brains behind it, to be honest. Nikhil is awesome. And he started abstracting out a lot of the logic from Solid that allows it to do kind of this full stack story using this code extraction. And recently Ryan was on with the Quick team talking about code extraction, and it was really great. We'll have to find the link to that and pop it in here. But that's kind of how Bling was born. I imagined kind of this world where, it didn't matter what framework you were using. All that mattered was, you met a couple of dependencies like Vite or Babel, or maybe we'd even support SWC, right? But at the end of the day, you could do these code transforms and the bundler would kind of separate your stuff. And what happened was after we solved that piece, just kind of a proof of concept, the only piece that was left over was the deployment story. Again, something that I don't want to build. I look at all the work that went into Next and their deployment story and Remix and all the adapters that they maintain, and I just didn't want to have to deal with any of that. Well, another good friend from Astro is like, we talked with Fred a whole lot at Astro. And it's like, look at Astro. It's exactly what I wanted, right? And me and Ryan were looking at it like, dude, Astro, they don't even know what they're sitting on. It's gold mine, right? Where they've built all the adapters. They've built all the infrastructure, and they literally are very agnostic about the front end. So we decided, let's build a new framework. TanStack Start, and let's upgrade Solid Start eventually, right? To say we're gonna build everything on top of Astro and just get deployments and get compiler and get all of that for free. Astro's built on top of Vite. So all we have to do is supply Vite functionality for Bling, and then we can wrap all that up into an Astro plugin, and then you can just use whatever router you want, and there's your framework, right? You've got a router, you've got code extraction, and you've got deployment. And at the end of the day, those are most of the core pieces you need to have what people think of as a framework. And so TanStack Start itself isn't even really a library yet. There's nothing. I mean, there is a little bit there. It houses the plugin for Astro that you import. And then there's a couple of components for doing React things like, serializing all the hydration data and unserializing it and hooking it up to TanStack Router. But aside from that, most of the logic just sits inside of Router and inside of Bling, and then all the great stuff that Astro has given us. So it's still a work in progress, but that's kind of the vision that I have for it. And we're also very keen on kind of the ecosystem moving towards like React server components. And I personally don't think that server components should necessarily be branded or owned by a specific framework. They're more of just a concept overall. And we see the use server and the use client, and that's just one way to do it, right? But server components, they're bigger than that. They're like Astro technically had server components a long time ago. But I think that everybody's converging on these patterns. And instead of chasing after these patterns that will only work in React and probably only work in Next for a while, I'm way more interested in pursuing framework agnostic solutions to the same thing. I think that with a little bit of work and some collaboration, we could achieve server components for all with code extraction, that kind of fits the majority use case. Maybe not the whole resumability, really, really granular stuff like Quick. It fits a good use case for everybody. So that's where we want to take it. And to be honest, we'd probably be a little bit further, but I've been on vacation for 2 weeks and I'm kind of heads down at Nozzle right now on some sprints, but it's coming. The day's coming where I think we're going to have some good progress. In fact, I have a call scheduled tonight with Ryan and Nikhil where we're going to discuss a lot of fun things. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, that sounds super interesting. Once it gets a little further along, we might have to have Nikhil on to dive deeper into those topics.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The code extraction is really fun. I mean, you get into Babel and AST transformations, and it's a lot of fun. So,
want to hear a full conversation with Tanner? Subscribe to us on Patreon, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Okay, that wraps it up for tooltips this week. Thanks for coming on, Tanner. This was a lot of fun. The conversation we had about how we started with your beginnings in TypeScript and how that's fed into what you're working on now with TanStack Router, I thought was super interesting, and I'm super excited to see where you guys go with it.
Me too.
Yeah, Tanner, such a pleasure. Use your stuff every day. You've done great work. You continue to do great work. Just wish you the best.
And I also need to shout out before we close out TK Dodo and Kevin Vandy and Pysic. I mean, these guys, they maintain, they help me maintain or just flat out maintain a lot of it, of those libraries that I don't necessarily have time to just be everywhere all at once. They are honestly what's keeping these libraries up and afloat and making them better. And just kind of all the sponsorships that we have on TanStack is what makes that possible. So they deserve as much or maybe more credit for a lot of this stuff than I do. So we've got to make sure that they get their dues.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Love the sentiment.